Hello and welcome. What sort of progress has China made in the 6 decades since it became a republic? When Mao Zedong took power in China in October 1949, his country was emerging from a brutal civil war, and its 500 million people were largely poor, illiterate and working the land to survive. Well, 60 years later, China is the world's third largest economy, and its 1.3 billion people are making leaps and bounds in development and industrialization. Beijing's been marking the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China with much fanfare and a massive display of military power. The ruling Communist Party seemed to hammer the point it wanted to make. It has made China strong, increasingly prosperous and respected in the world, and it is in firm control. But for the rest of the world, China remains a paradox, with people asking if it should play a bigger role in world affairs due to its economic power, or if it's a developing country hobbled by poverty. And China is also regularly criticized for its treatment of minorities and dissidents. So today we ask, what has 60 years of communist rule brought for the world's most populous country? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE. You can enter the chat room and take part. We also take your phone calls on the show. Joining me today is Harry Wu, one of the most prominent Chinese dissidents in the West. As a young man, he was imprisoned for criticizing the Communist Party and spent 19 years in China's forced labor prison camps, the Laogai. He joins us now from New York, where he has founded the Laogai Research Foundation. And from Los Angeles, we have Mike Chinoy, an American journalist who spent years covering China and Asia. First went there in 1973. He's currently senior fellow at the U.S.-China Institute at the University of Southern California and author of Meltdown, the inside story of the North Korean nuclear crisis. I welcome you both to the show. And Mike, if I could start with you, leading nations are meeting in Geneva to discuss Iran's latest missile test and declaration of a second nuclear facility. What role will China play, considering it's such a strong ally of Iran?
Well, the Chinese clearly have major economic interests with Iran and a long track record of opposing sanctions or coercion. On the other hand, they don't want this crisis to blow up. They certainly don't want to see any military action taken by Israel. So my guess is that they will gently nudge the Iranians to be somewhat more cooperative and at the same time urge the Americans and the Europeans not to go full bore on sanctions.
Well, if it's pressured, I mean, Russia's stepped back a little bit. Russia's another one with interests with Iran, and if Russia has stepped back, what pressure is there on China to put aside its commercial interests and look at what some consider a global security issue?
Certainly that's the case that's going to be made, particularly by the Americans and the Europeans. But as I say, the Chinese have a pretty strong track record of being very uneasy with sanctions, both because of their own commercial interests and because I think they feel that ultimately they're ineffective.
Well, Harry Wu, great to have you on the show as well, sir. And I wonder, what could China do in terms of having some influence on Iran in order to help pull back its nuclear ambitions, if that's the pressure that's being put on?
I think I pay attention that's only country of the world except all of these United Nations security countries pass a resolution, and only Chinese stand together with the Iranian. And at the same time, Chinese and Iranians signed a contract with oil, because Chinese very concerned about the oil in the future. But anyway, I want to tell you that China is only communist country today in the world. It's only totalitarian regime in the world. And I will say that will not stay too long, that continuing as a totalitarian regime in the world.
Looking at I'll get on to the economics, Mr. Wu. I'll get on to the economics in a second, but let me ask you about the foreign policy as we're discussing what's happening with China's role in Iran as well. But I wonder, when you look at China as a player in the world, to what extent do you feel its foreign policies are based entirely on its economic concerns? I mean, what interest does China have in actually playing an active part in, for example, the Middle East conflicts, in the situation in Sudan? Does China have a role to play, you feel?
Yes, China today is not talking about world revolution. It's not going to support the rebelling party in this country to rebel the government. It's very different now. But anyway, the communism revolution is a moral issue. Basically, it's a moral issue. It's not like a talking economic situation. For example, 1960, 40 million people died in starvation inside China. China is a poor country. The whole country still support Mao Zedong revolution at all. Okay. Today, the economy is well because the West capitalism support them and do business with them. Chinese become supposed okay. But is the Chinese really want to have a kind of country without the religious freedom, without the birth control, without the free to give a birth, is to set up labor camps and propaganda control the medium and one party ruling, no election. Normally the people don't like it, don't want to have it. That revolution sooner or later will come. The Soviet Communist Party is a good example. The Yeltsin talked to the communist members, say, should we need to our communist revolution in the future? The people say no. The Communist Party dismissed.
All right, well, Mike, you know, we're hearing Harry Wu saying, of course, that China is the only remaining totalitarian regime, the only real sort of communist regime. But considering its economic reforms, or considering its economic path at least, can it be still considered truly a communist country?
I think in many ways the word communist doesn't have much meaning in China. The Chinese Communist Party has really evolved into a more conventional authoritarian party dominating political life in China. And I think it's important to draw, there's a key distinction here. The first 30 years of communist rule in China after the Mao's revolution in 1949, I think were largely disastrous. Harry was right, tens of millions of people starved to death during the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s. There was chaos and tumult and much suffering during Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 60s and early 70s. It's really only in the late 70s when Mao's successor Deng Xiaoping took over and began to implement market-style economic reforms that things began to turn around. And so today, I think if you go to China, what is so striking is the degree of personal freedom as opposed to political freedom that people have. Whereas when I first went to China in 1973, the state controlled where you lived, where you worked, whether you could travel, what you read, what you watched on TV, who you could marry, a whole host of things. Today, people are largely free to live their lives as long as they stay away from politics, and that's a result of these. That's a result of these changes. But the critical question, I think, for the Chinese Communist Party is if they don't implement some kind of political reforms to help manage the tumultuous economic changes they've set in motion, they're going to have problems down the road. And at the moment, the party is so uptight that it continues to keep the lid on the political system, even as there's this tremendous social ferment in the rest of the country produced by all these reforms.
Yeah, this view.
Go ahead, Harry.
The personal view about, his view is represented many American experts today talking about China, is communism have no meaning in China. Okay, why the Communist Party cannot change their party's name? Don't call Chinese Communist Party. You can't do that. The political structure, the propaganda department, the organization department control everything. It's not like whatever he said, the people is great freedom and they whatever. Even Chinese today are not free to give a birth. Roman Catholic in China is illegal. Labor camps still over there. Sitao was there. What are you talking about freedom in China?
All right, let me before I get Mike's response, let me get on the phone from Switzerland. We have a viewer by the name of Harry. Harry, go ahead from Switzerland.
Yes, my question is whether it's America, India, Russia, or China, there's always a conflict about the opposition sides. Why can't people just let somebody try and prove what is wrong and right and criticize it afterwards?
Okay. Mike, it comes down to could China feasibly...
Let me make a comment.
Sorry, Mr. Wood, let me just do one thing. Let's get Mike's response to what you were saying, and also the idea what our caller Harry in Switzerland said about the idea of having opposition, I mean a viable opposition. Could it even be considered in China, the way things are?
The Chinese Communist Party isn't going to change its name because its political legitimacy stems from Mao leading this revolution, which the party likes to describe as having led the Chinese people to stand up and take their rightful place in the world. And it certainly does have the structure of a traditional kind of authoritarian party. But I think the reality when you go to China and travel around, as I've been doing repeatedly, most recently just a couple of months ago, in terms of people's personal lives, there is unquestionably greater freedom. That doesn't mean there is full freedom, and there are certainly many areas where people are constricted by the system and by the nature of the society they're living in. But when you compare it to 25 or 30 years ago, there's no comparison. And I think, as I say, the challenge for the Communist Party is how to manage these forces that they've set in motion and how to simultaneously cling on to power while accelerating the economic growth. After the Tiananmen Square crackdown 20 years ago, there was a kind of implicit bargain between the Communist Party and the Chinese people, which was basically, as long as people didn't challenge the party's monopoly on political power, the party gave them more opportunities to better their own lives. And that's a bargain a lot of Chinese have accepted. The question is, going forward, can it be sustained given all the problems internally that China faces now?
Now, Harry, I'm going to ask you to just hold for 1 second because I want to get your opinion, but I want to just take a very short break and we'll come straight back to you. As we pause, let me remind you, our viewers, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com and enter the chat room where a debate is taking place right now. And we'll be right back.